Hai Juliet.
Halo Titi.
How are you?
Apa kabar?
Baik.
Sama-sama.
Sudah sehat ya?
Nice to be here.
Okay, good.
Do you want to, how do we start? Do I start presenting immediately or?
I will first introduce you.
Okay.
So I will read your CV also before you
Okay.
start your presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Let's check. Yeah, we can start maybe we should start at 4:30. It's now 4:29. Can we just wait a little bit? Maybe there will be more participants to join.
Yeah, of course, no worries.
Yeah.
Let me check if I can share screen. Yeah, okay. It seems to work.
Should we just start now because it's already 4:31? So, yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It is our pleasure to welcome first Professor Juliet Koning, who will deliver her presentation entitled Involving Local Fishing Communities in Policy Making, Addressing Illegal Fishing in Indonesia, as part of our webinar series conducted by UKSW to celebrate our 65th anniversary. I'm Titi Susilowati Prabowo, who will be the moderator for this webinar. I'm personally very happy to take part as the moderator in this webinar, as this webinar is a kind of reunion for me with Professor Juliet Koning. She used to be my PhD co-supervisor, and until recently, we still kept on collaborating on research and also on publication. So hopefully we will be able to continue collaborating in the near future. Well, before we start the webinar, I will first read Professor Koning's short CV. So Professor Juliet Koning is a professor of business and society, and at the moment she is the head of the organization strategy and entrepreneurship department at the School of Business and Economics, Maastricht University, the Netherlands. She holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Her research interests include entrepreneurship, sustainable development, and the organization of security. She has a keen interest in the co-creation of knowledge. Part of her research is conducted in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia and also in South Africa. That's the short CV of Professor Koning. Before we continue, I hope that all the participants turn off the microphone. After the presentation from Professor Koning, I will give you a chance to ask questions directly, or you can also write in the chat room. Now, floor is yours, Professor Koning. You have something like 30 minutes to deliver your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Titi. It's really lovely to connect, although virtually again, with you and your colleagues at Universitas Kristen Satyavacana. It's one of my favorite collaborations over the years. So first of all, many congratulations on your anniversary and happy more years to come, of course. Also in terms of us collaborating in future projects, depending on how the world develops.
Yes.
I will start sharing my screen. I've prepared a presentation. I know it's only 30 minutes, which is always a bit challenging for an anthropologist who talks about her field work. We always tend to take much more time. So I will probably go by the slides. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see it clearly here.
All right, yeah. Perfect. And I'll run through the slides. As you said, I will be speaking about one of the many projects I've conducted in Indonesia over the years. And this one is the most recent one, conducted with colleagues from universities in the UK. One of them is in the room, Professor Nordman, who is a co-leader of the project. So any questions that I don't know to answer, I will refer to him later on. And also with colleagues from Universitas Indonesia, in fact, for this project. So the main topic of the presentation and of our research is IUU fishing, or short for illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And this has been identified by the United Nations as one of the major threats to global maritime security. It causes an enormous loss of economic revenue, severe environmental damage, and far-reaching livelihood implications, in particular for local communities. Of course, this sparked our interest, which led to the project that I'll be talking about soon. Of course, Indonesia is one of the more challenging archipelagos out there, with the enormous amount of sea that is around all the many islands that it houses. So opportunities, challenges for IUU fishing are really enormous. And I think it was when the Jokowi government started, it became one of the major spearheads of the government to address IUU fishing in Indonesia. And I think a lot has been done in terms of trying to address it. However, one of the things that we know much less about is, in fact, how it affects local communities in Indonesia in this case, but also in other countries. And of course, that then is a lovely opportunity for people like me, anthropologists, to go out there and to understand what is actually happening at the local level. So studying fisheries in Indonesia, as I said, is obviously a challenge with Indonesia's enormous water amount and the sea between the different islands, many opportunities for illegal and criminal crimes. So the core challenges are that it's an economic loss. It was estimated into the billions US dollars annually, and more recently. Unsustainable fishing, of course, also threatens the habitat beyond repair, and that is something also the fishermen are talking about, as I will show later. These maritime crimes are not just local, and they're not just petty. In fact, they're also transnational and highly organized. The seas in and around Indonesia are also used for drug trafficking, for illegal migrant smuggling, and things like that. And the communities, the fishing communities, are, of course, the primary stakeholders in all of this. They account for 80% of fish production, of what goes on in Indonesia. They employ millions of people, and of course, are key knowledgeable agents of what is actually happening at sea, because that's where they are most of the time, day in, day out. So what did we do? We wrote a research project that got funding from UK agencies. The project was written by scholars from UK universities. So it was when I was still working in the UK, together with Coventry University and colleagues of the law department, and a particular section that focuses on legal maritime questions at Universitas Indonesia. The main participants in our research were fishermen. The research included fishing communities far and wide across Indonesia, so North Sumatra, South Java, Flores, Southeast Sulawesi, and East Nusa Tenggara. And different teams visited each of these locations. I myself visited the South Java and the Southeast Sulawesi communities. We also conducted research with main maritime agencies involved. So the Maritime Security Agency, the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, Ministry of Migration, the Sea Police, and the Navy. Because one of the aims of the research was to see how we could bring together the local communities and the maritime agencies in order to address this problem. For this presentation, however, I will mainly focus on the outcomes at the community level. The approach that we took in our research consisted of interviews, informal conversations. As you can see, us standing here in one of the locations, just chatting near the harbor with fishermen on whatever it is that they encounter at sea. And of course, observations when we were there. But we also used a rather novel and creative method consisting of asking the participants to develop collages. That's a kind of poster expressing in visual ways the things that happen at sea, which was a very nice tool. And I will show one of the outcomes at the end of my presentation. We use that as a talking tool to address these issues. One of the things that we focused on, how do both parties, in this case local fishing communities, how do they understand, respond to, and are affected by IUU fishing? Big question, and in fact, some really interesting outcomes. And I will focus mainly on the outcomes and what can be concluded from this research, as I only have about 20 minutes. Let me check the time. Okay, going well. So there are 4 main outcomes that came to the fore, and I will talk you through all 4 of them. Of course, not unsuspected, and maybe none of the outcomes are unexpected, but one of the main issues is, of course, the issue of marine governance. Who are the people involved in governing the seas and making sure that IUU activities do not take place? And we all know that they do take place. And that is, of course, a big challenge for a country like Indonesia with the many islands and you know, governance very often seated in Jakarta, also in local governments, but how to make those communication lines function and how to get the parties at the same table. Many of the comments were around shortcomings of local governments or authorities to actually address what takes place at sea, whereas those that we spoke to in Jakarta, of course, all say we don't have the resources to do it all. So that's an interesting question also around resources and governance. The turning of a blind eye, corruption, lack of support, and favoritism. I guess these are not novel outcomes in Indonesia as such. And of course, they also play a role when we talk about maritime security and maritime issues. And they were quite prominently expressed. And if you see the text in italics, these are quotes from the fishers, for instance, such as the national government should respond immediately to our problems in the regions. In the regions, the local authorities seem to be closing their eyes. So there is, of course, you can see we talked about many different stakeholders in very different regional arenas. But I guess the farther away from the center, the feeling of not being included and not being part of the problem or seen as part of the solving the problem was one of the things. And the closing of the eyes could be on things like things that happen at sea, where there were illegal transfers of fish from one boat to another, or foreign vessels in the waters. So maritime governance, still a big question and not one that can be solved easily, of course. The second main outcome is indeed illegality is a main problem at sea. There's a range of illegal activities that are being witnessed. Use of illegal means to fish, so that could be bombs or poison. Crossing boundaries, there are boundaries also across the regions, and fishermen are very keen to make sure that there are no foreigners, and that could be other Indonesian fishermen, of course, in their own bounded area. The selling of fish mid-sea, and of course, tragically also trafficking of people. And we came across quite a number of examples of the latter as well, where fishermen were lured by international syndicates to smuggle people to Australia, for instance. The syndicates, as the quote runs, whose business is smuggling illegal immigrants to Australia, try to convince the fishermen and the fishermen who would be influenced, because rather than fighting to make a living every day, it would be better to work as an illegal immigrant smuggler. Of course, this has a lot to do with the money that's being offered. As you can see, 40 million rupiah, 30 million rupiah, those are amounts of money that a lot of local fishermen can only dream of. Of course, these are very tragic and sad stories. Very often the money is never paid and the fishermen get caught because Australia is very strict in guarding the waters. So a range of illegal activities that are being witnessed. And of course, sometimes the fishing communities are part and parcel of it. And they are very honest and open about this. The third outcome concerns economic hardship and concerns about the future of the marine environment. First of all, of course, many concerns about next generations. Things like, there might be nothing left to fish for our children and grandchildren. The habitat is actually degrading. Different fish varieties are disappearing. And of course, on land, lack of alternative economic activities. I think everybody who might have visited fishing communities they're very often at near sea, and inland there aren't that many opportunities. So they are really asking questions about, how can we change our own behavior within this complex situation that there's not much alternative for us. So one of the quote runs, "We think that after our generation, if we don't maintain this, then we'll only leave a story for our grandchildren, a big empty story," which is in fact a very sad quote, because the coral reefs and everything else will be damaged. So there is huge awareness that something needs to change and something needs to happen. So it's almost like a catch-22. And then finally, an expressed concern is education. There are restricted educational opportunities, hardly any local skill training for, let's say, women in the fishing communities to start local activities, lack of knowledge on the regulations. And I've tried to understand myself, these fishing regulations, they're really complicated. They're both local and international. And it's very often difficult for the fishermen to really understand them and follow them. And as they also say, sometimes they don't understand these international regulations. And as they say, since we have little education and experience, lack of dissemination by the government to the community. And then they talk about funding, especially to women in fishing villages regarding creative alternatives that may provide additional income. So these four main outcomes express a very strong feeling of not being seen as such by both the national and local governments. Of course, it's one side of the story, but I guess an important one, because we often do not hear directly from the local communities involved how they perceive these issues. And it's not as if they were only talking about the main problems that they are encountering. In fact, it was quite interesting to see that they were very eager to join the conversation and to become part and parcel of the solutions, as this quote very clearly articulates. They say, in fact, it's us, the fishermen, who spend most time at sea. The fishermen know what activities are happening. If the government wants to identify the problems occurring at sea without directly involving the fishing communities as the source of concrete information, then these inputs would be useless. You can see a clear expression here of wanting to be part of the communication. If the government properly disseminates good information, empowers the people, and pays attention to our welfare, maybe then the fishermen will help the government by becoming their eyes and ears. And I thought that was a really interesting expression, to monitor illegal activities and to identify all kinds of misconduct happening at sea. So there is really an issue of trade-off, of trust involved, because they do see a lot of the IUU fishing issues that are happening, but they might be reluctant to share if they feel there isn't a two-way system in all of this. I will move to some concluding remarks, and then we can have plenty of opportunity to talk about some of these findings. So clearly, our research indicates that there are interrelated problems in IUU fishing. The interrelated issues being the environmental level, so depletion of resources, damaging of the marine habitat. They're clearly socioeconomic, the unbridled illegal activities taking place at sea, their cultural favoritism, corruption, and of course political, expressed in the weak marine governance. And these are problems that the fishermen are very aware of, and of course also struggle with, as much as our conversation with the national agencies involved alluded to as well. The research also indicates a strong will by the fishermen to be seen as knowledgeable agents who can help solve the problem by better dissemination of information and cooperation between the local government and the fishing communities. And in fact, we did bring them together in one of our final events of this project in Jakarta, where representatives of the fishing communities and of those agencies in Jakarta were brought together in a conference room in Jakarta, and where we tried to get that conversation going, which was it was really interesting to see how difficult it was at start, but in the end, people did open up and they were quite open about their shared problems. I think one of the things also that this research showed is that many fishing communities might feel very alone, and by bringing them together as we did, they started to see that they're part of a bigger problem, which goes beyond their own local level. So one of the things that we, of course, suggest is that these local fishing communities and their representatives become part of national and international policy making that addresses IUU fishing in Indonesia. And these local dimensions are often overlooked or ignored. Yes, fishing communities, as well as some of the agencies at sea, are part and parcel of the problem, but they can also combined be members of solving the problem. Final comment, more attention should be paid to the enhancement of inclusive government structures, the formulation and implementation of policies and regulations that take local fishing communities into account, and of course, accountable cooperation between local and national governmental authorities. I know it almost sounds like a dream, too good to be true, but I hope our project at least brought the parties together and made a start in making that conversation happening. So finally, this is one of the collages that was created by a group of fishermen expressing the things that I talked about, things that clearly show in the poster on education and culture, on hoping to be able to enjoy the natural resources in the future, the role of the local governments, quite a lot of interesting points that then became part of discussion within the group, because these posters were discussed together with representatives of the fishing communities around the same table, also in Jakarta. And it was quite nice to see these communities respond to each other. So next that we brought them to Jakarta, we also visited all the fishing communities, of course, as a team. The findings of this, what I talked about here just now, can be found in a paper that was published by Marine Policy, written by me, Janos Chaptels and Mark Nordman, as team members. So if you're interested to read more, you can find this paper online, or you can send me an email, and I'm happy to share the paper with you. That's it from me, Titi. I hope I stayed well within your time limit, so I will stop sharing screen.
Yes, I think you finished just on time. Thank you very much, Juliet. So thank you for your presentation, your insightful presentation. So we have learned how complex it is, the problem with IUU fishing phenomenon in Indonesia. So now we will continue with questions or comments from audience. Let's start with the first two questions. Please, you can press your raise hand button, or you can also write in chat room. Anyone wants to start? Any questions or comments? Please. Oh, yeah, from Professor Heidi Dals. It's really a reunion, three of us here.
Sorry, I can't hear this. So
we can't hear you.
Can you? I can't hear Heidi, but can you hear Heidi? Then maybe you can.
No, I can't hear Heidi either.
All right.
Yes, she will type.
Yeah.
The question.
I can, of course, also say a little bit more about how we conducted the research if those present are interested in it. My co-lead is also in the room, so if you want to know more about the governance side of things, then I'm sure Matt Nordman is happy to give a few comments on this as well. But let's see what Heidi Dales wants to know.
Yes. Okay. Or anybody else wants to ask questions while we are waiting for the question from Prof. Heidi Dales, maybe?
I see Ahmed has raised a hand.
Oh, yeah. Please, Mr. Ahmad Malkan.
Oh, thank you very much, Bu Titi. Thank you very much, Professor Koning. Let me introduce myself, Malkan. And this event was referred to me by Henry Sandy. We were together at the World Bank when I supported the national logistic team back in until 2018. I'm very familiar with the problems mentioned by Professor Koning. It's everywhere. One of the dreadful effect now, we had a pilot to establish the port of Bitung, is North Sulawesi, to be the international hub port. And the problem was at that time, because of the regulation of the Ministry of KKP, the fisherman has to go to fish directly to the sea, and they need hard cash to pay for their catch, not like before, because what there was what they called kapal pengumpul for 10 fishermen, small ships. But learning from that, one issue that I would like to stress, but it's a bit outside of your presentation. I'm now asked by a colleague of mine, which were together with the logistic team national. She is now the CEO of the, I don't know whether you're familiar with this port, Krakatau Bengawan Sejahtera. It's in Tangerang. And we approached already the Ministry of Kelautan, and that port is established now to be one of the exporting port of fish from Indonesia. The plan is to first establish market, proper market, so the fishermen can bring directly their catch. And in this market is, it's not really modern. We have example like the one in Japan, and that's the kind of model that we would like to establish. So my question is, of course, this market, fish market, will be in cooperation with the local government, as you mentioned, because the area will be subjected to the local government. My question is there any party that you can refer that we start approaching them if there is a possibility of cooperation? You mentioned something about the education. We were able to establish a D3 program in close to the port, the Krakatau Bengawan port. So in the nutshell, my question is, you mentioned, how to attack this problem. One of them, of course, because this fisherman is really dependent on, because they cannot sell directly their product, their catch to the market. So if we have
sorry, Mr. Malkan, can you just make it short, your question or comment?
I understand. I understand the question. So,
right. If there is a party that we can approach, then we can discuss how to. But the idea from our side first is to establish a market. I mean, a modern market with the proper warehouses and things like that, electricity.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I understand the question, and sometimes the issue of marketing the catch is indeed a concern. In particular, as some of the comments were that fish is sometimes transferred at sea, and sometimes also under pressure. So it's not always voluntarily. Sometimes it's also under pressure to exchange gasoline for fish and other ways around. Clearly, proper channels to be able to market fish are important. Of course, many use local ports, and sometimes even at that level, there are, as we heard, sometimes unclear guidelines. There are middlemen in these local ports who have very strong power positions. The fishermen might be in debt with them because they offer all kinds of equipment for the boats. So sometimes there's no solution there. But I guess it's definitely one of the issues that needs to be included in addressing the problem of what happens at sea. So thank you for your comments. I think there are some questions in the chat.
Yes, there are more questions here. Maybe I can read the question from Prof. Heidi Dallas first.
Yeah, sure.
Is there any plan about diversification of the maritime livelihoods? We learned that fishermen in Komodo first converted to tourism employees and now under COVID returned to harvesting maritime resources. Would an expansion into tourism services bring some reprieve in the situation studied? That's the first from Heidi. You will answer it first, or because there are still more questions here?
Well, let me take them one by one, otherwise it becomes, they're all from a different nature. So I guess the tourism question is, of course, an interesting one, and it can be a solution. It depends, I guess, in many cases on how that location is transferable to tourism, and we've been to some locations where you can imagine it, and other locations where you think, well, I'm not sure who's going to come here. So it's tricky, and I think one of the things that came very strongly across from the communities is that sometimes they lack either information, education, or maybe also imagination of what to do. So you would need some interesting people to take that on. I can't remember having heard that they were going into tourism, but Matt Nordman is here as well. Maybe he remembers whether this came up as one of the solutions. I don't think so, but I might be wrong. Do you remember, Matt, whether there was anybody talking about tourism options? Trying to bring
no, sorry, I don't. You're right. I don't recall.
Yeah. So that was definitely not one on the radar, and I haven't heard any of the agencies that we talked to think about this as well. I think everybody is focusing on, the IUU problem as such. So it could be an interesting solution, of course.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. We'll continue with the next question is from Pak Umbu Manggana. Indonesia has a very wide sea area. Therefore, several researchers say that illegal fishing is inevitable there. Illegal fishing in Indonesia occurs because of the inadequate infrastructures needed to avoid illegal fishing, coupled with the lack of law enforcement by the government in recent time. Likewise, fishermen lack of understanding of the zones where they can operate and where they cannot operate. The question is, according to Professor, from the existing problems, where are the important points that need to be prioritized for handling so that it has an impact on the settlement of illegal fishing in Indonesia?
Thank you. A very
Okay,
important
that's
question.
the question
And
from Pak Umum.
yeah, thank you. It's a very good question, a very important one, and also one very difficult to answer. I think one of the things that we try to do is to at least open up a channel of communication between the agencies involved, the ones that I mentioned, such as Bakamla, the Navy, the ministry, and of course, you know, they are in Jakarta, but they of course have their local local representatives in the regions, just to get that line of communication going. Because one of the first things that we really noted was there is no connection between the two. And I think if you want to address a problem like IUU fishing in Indonesia, clearly some kind of communication between whatever level of governance there is and the fishing and fishing communities involved is core. What the government, of course, did do was to focus on the foreign vessels that came into Indonesian waters. You might remember that under Ibu Susi, there was quite some strong policies going on in terms of making sure that there were no bigger vessels and international and foreign vessels in the seas. But that's only part of the problem. And I think we touch upon more local and diverse problems as such, and indeed very intricate, because all the things are almost interrelated and therefore very difficult to untangle and to take apart. So I guess, yeah, it's what comes first. Well, I hope that what we try to do is to, along the communication, is at least one, and to ask attention for the voice of those local fishing communities involved, because that is still missing. Maybe Matt wants to join the conversation. Is Matt, if you have your hand up, maybe you want to respond?
Now, just quickly, I think what we learned is that the problems are, as we call it, are wicked. They're wicked problems. They're complex problems, and there is not one solution for everything. So that is a little bit so where it is an economic problem, a cultural problem, a legal problem, a normative problem. All these things work together. And when I hear the speakers say, you know, we have to set priorities, that is in a wicked problem very difficult. Because, for example, we don't know, if I refer to Professor Malkan again, if we establish a new market or we establish a new harbor, or we, you know, whether the cultural, economic, social problems are not transferred from one to another. So there is no reason to assume if we just build a new harbor or a new fishing market, that problems of corruption and law will not continue to exist. So I think sometimes it's more necessary to really go to the bottom of these wicked problems and understand what is going on, enter into conversations, then to come up with another solution. I would leave the solution to the policymakers and the politicians rather to the academics. So I think that's what I learned from it. The problem is, so as Judith said, intrinsic and complicated and wicked, that there is no easy solution that fits all situations.
Maybe my a small comment for Professor Nordman. The program will be that I mentioned about the market. The program will be under the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce, because this head of that port is also the new elected head of supply chains, national supply chains in Indonesia. The school is there, the technical school. So my question actually in the beginning to Professor Juliet is about, is there any reference of party that can be contacted by the port in order to invite them, you know, to discuss the problem? Who knows, there will be some kind of cooperation. I mean, down to us approach from the bottom. And the local government is already, we spoke to them. they're also
So maybe it's, I think some of the parties we talk to in Jakarta, I mean, they might be your partners already. Of course, the Ministry of Fisheries, Bakamla, I guess those are the institutions you want to have partly there, I guess, because they are overseeing national policy.
Okay.
Shall we go back to some of the other questions? There's some.
Yeah, I think so too. So there is one comment, actually, it's only comment. There is a satellite system available to monitor and guard the sea against illegal fishing. I think this is just a comment. The next question comes from Christina. Do you think that a more local governance would help and improve the situation and enable the local fishermen to be more involved in this problem solving?
I think it's clearly, I think what the local, of course, that is the clearest or the nearest point of reference for many of the fishing communities, which is their local governance and government. I think, as Matt said, you know, there is the problems are so wicked and so interrelated that there are many other things going on, and sometimes, of course, governments and local government officials are as much part and parcel of the problem as some of the fishing communities, and everybody's quite open about this. So there is also a more cultural question involved. You know, how do we take away favoritism? Levels of corruption, because they are continuously there, and of course part and parcel of the problem. But yeah, they are the first point of reference.
Okay. Yeah. The next question comes from Pak Untung. From your point, why small people or community always left behind in development intervention when government tends to improve their life? As an activist, it is often happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is that I guess I can say that often happens, and one of the things that we've tried to do is to at least give them voice. There are some very strong voiced local community members, and we had one of them as part of one of the faraway regions, but they were very active in making a case for their environment and wrote all kinds of leaflets and communication tools to bring to the attention. But of course, if you don't have a lot of power, you're also easily to be brushed aside. So there is, I think, some of the things that the project accomplishes, that some of them are still in touch. So there are now also communications between these fishing communities, and therefore maybe combined they have a stronger voice than when each and everyone does it on their own.
Okay, the next question comes from Mr. Dedi. In Malacca Street, small-scale fishers have been fighting with illegal trawl operators. Some rhymes took the form of violence involving burning of the trawl's boat. They have been doing that since 1980s. Would you have a say what they failed to get rid of the trawl? What effort should be put to help them? That's the question from Mr. Dedi. Would you answer that question first, or should I continue with the next question?
Yeah, I don't think I have a straightforward answer here.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess one of the things that we heard also from Bakamla and other Jakarta agencies is that they're really trying to get funding to have more boats out there to monitor, and of course, you know, sometimes they only have one or two boats that they can send out, and you know, it's almost like an impossibility, as somebody wrote in the chat. Will this problem ever go away? I think it's also not our intention, and of course it's impossible for us, as Matt said, to solve it. I think what we're trying to say is, please include these local voices in whatever means going forward, and I guess that's what I can repeat on this.
Okay. Yeah, actually, this is also a comment from Mr. Sharif. There are difficulties involving the fishing community in policy making in Indonesia. to overcome the problem of illegal fishing, because the policy making model is controlled by political economic forces. Well, actually, your comment or what you mentioned before is that we need to involve the fishing community in policy making in Indonesia. Maybe you can comment on this point.
Yeah, the policy model is controlled by political economic forces. Yes, absolutely. That's something that clearly came to the fore as well. And it's Matt might have. He's much more the governance scholar in the room. So Matt, maybe you have something more to say, because we also talked, of course, about governance, the governance side of things. Do you want to comment?
Yeah. There's two things. First of all, governance, of course, is the combination of all actors and stakeholders involved. It's not just central government who is governing the country. It's wider than that. The other interesting thing is the burning of boats, which we saw became a government policy years ago under it was Susi. But that's also the policy of local fishermen who burn boats of other fishermen from other localities who cross borders. Now, there is an interesting normative aspect because that's what we call self-help. And sometimes it's very difficult to, on the one hand, ask the government to enforce the law, but yourself are not kind of respecting the law. You just burn boats of those that you consider crossing boundaries. So again, we have these wicked problems that, what kind of law enforcement is failing, local fishermen resort to self-help, that kind of diminishes the trust in law enforcement again. So it's a very good example of how this circle goes round and round. And you have to break it somewhere, and where to break it is an interesting question. But the burning of boats for me is really a kind of a symbol of how the law enforcement system and the government system has broken down.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, the question from Mr. Benny Yusrisa from Paramadina, this is something to do with your research. There's an effort to link the IU and the modern slavery or human trafficking issue. However, it seems like the attention is more at migrant fishing crews than local ones. In your field work, did the interlocutora identify the aspects of forced labor or trafficking? The last question from Mr. Benusrisa.
Sorry, I'm reading the question again. In your field,
okay.
Forced labor. There is, yeah, as I mentioned, there were definitely cases of trafficking that the communities talked about. Of course, that is a highly difficult topic and sensitive, and it was also quite at times very emotional stories around this, and I think that sometimes people are really lured into these international syndicates and schemes, and clearly regretting all of this, sometimes also being very honest, knowing that the kind of money that is being offered could be a way out of many problems. And of course, that is really difficult to have to admit. So yeah, clearly we came across these forced labor. I know of the issue of forced labor on boats. That was not at the level that we talked about, because these are very often local fishermen with their local crew, very often from the same village. Of course, it might be that, the way the catch is divided is less honest than maybe we would want, but there was, as far as I remember, it wasn't a forced labor issue, but I know that's definitely taking place. It was much more the trafficking of illegal migrants, and and some stories of being caught by Australian Navy and being held in prison over what they did. So yeah, this is happening and taking place.
Okay. Yeah. Next question comes from Mr. Sudarno. Actually, it has something to do with credit, access to credit. Do you think that providing better access to credit will help address your third finding, which is to improve fishermen's well-being and reduce economic hardship?
Well, of course, we all know that microfinance might be a solution. We also know that microfinance and microcredit can have detrimental effects. So I guess it really depends on how it's implemented, how it's monitored. And, again, with all the other problems involved, how to play that in a clean sheet way is going to be a real challenge. If there is no funding, if there's no money, and if the fish is just to survive from day to day, I mean, there are no other means, clearly, to come out of these intricate problems. And I guess, like everybody else, there are ways in which microfinance, microcredit might help if it comes with unattached elements to it, I guess, which is not always the case.
Okay. Yeah. So there's one more question. Yeah, sorry, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I think there was somebody who wrote, what can students or scholars do for this issue?
Yes, this is what I'm going to,
Yeah, I think it's a nice question. It comes back to the point made by Matt Nordman here. I guess sometimes we want to do both. Sometimes we need to stick at doing what we're good at, which is the research part, I would say, at least that counts for me. And then I can develop ideas for policy making. I can communicate with policymakers, as we've done. And sometimes that is what is really needed, because without the research, I don't think you can develop good policy in the first place. So we need to keep feeding our research and our research findings as much as possible to policymakers. Make ourselves heard. That's why I talk about co-creation of research, which is co-creation with the people involved, but also co-creation with policymakers. And I must say that our engagement with the parties in Jakarta was as interesting as it was with the local communities. And also the policymakers are not necessarily only the bad guys, so to speak. Also, they want to move forward and want to be able to solve the problems and have their own intricate problems that are encountered. And one of the interesting things that came out of that part of the research, maybe to add, is that they discovered that they were not communicating to each other. So you have 5 agencies in Jakarta, all focusing on what happens at sea. And they have to discover that, in fact, they're all in isolation. They are all isolated and doing their own thing. So one of the things that came out of this, and also as part of Coventry University's bigger plan, was to develop communication lines between those different agencies, because maybe combined, they can make a bigger fist than when they all do their own thing and not communicate to each other.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Koning. We still have something like 5 minutes, I think. If you still have questions, please say so. Do you still have questions for Professor Koning or probably to Professor Nordman? I think this is just a very special opportunities to have 2 scholars at one webinar.
Yeah. We have 3. Yes. We also have Heidi Dales in the room.
Oh yeah, right.
And 44 other people who I hopefully are all scholars.
Okay. Any more questions, please?
Maybe if there's no further question, maybe again to let you know that the other side of the research was with these local authorities in Jakarta, and I think one of the outcomes there is that they are also quite eager to collaborate and to open up this communication channel with the local fishing communities. I guess what surprised us probably most was that it needed this project to some extent to get that going, to get those, I mean, and there might have been more projects, and, you know, like many projects, they come and go, and it might have been on the table before. But we felt there was a real interest in actually continuing this. So we're also thinking about the follow-up research, because sometimes that's the other side of us as researchers. The project finishes, we present our findings, and then we move on. So I think for this one, which became really close to our hearts, we really want to see if we can do a follow-up research and find funding to continue, to go back to the same communities, to go back to the same policymakers, and to see if phase 2 can push the project forwards. And I think that would be a message, I think, to everybody in the room interested in research and policy. I think we have to be careful not to jump from one project to the other, as we tend to do. And I know I'm part of that same community, so I understand.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Koning. We have, I think, comments or question from Mr. Sudarno Sumarto. Please.
This is my second question, Professor Juliet. Excellent presentation, excellent paper. I just want to follow up on this one. I think you highlight about the importance of information, empowerment. But because I'm working in between government and also researcher at SMERU, I think from the government point of view, would like to have more tangible policy option in terms of information. What kind of information? For the follow-up study, I propose, if possible, probably you can do some kind of an experiment of looking at some areas with some intervention and areas that there's a control. I'm a randomness kind of guy who is doing a lot of that one. Just to give you an example, this is a very complex issue, not only on the fisheries, but also in other areas. Actually, we did a study in the forestry. This is on the burning of the forest in Riau in about 100 villages. And we actually randomized the villages by giving an incentive of about 100 million by the end of the year if they able to prevent forest fire from happening in the village. That 100 million turned out to be not having an impact to the forest burning in that area because of this big giant corporation that we don't know what's going on. So it's a very complex and very elusive issue. So I think probably we can, for your follow-up studies, if you can do things like that, it will be whether it is about livelihood or economic hardship, especially to address the illegality and also the governance issues. Sorry, I cannot turn off my camera because I'm driving. Thank you so much, Ibu Titi and Pak Henry Sunday for inviting me to this excellent webinar. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Pak Sudarno. Do you want to give comments on that, Juliet?
Yeah, thanks for this insight. I think it comes down to where more or less what we concluded. They are intricate problems, very difficult to solve. I'm not sure if it needs to start somewhere, and that's why I think it would be very good to do a follow-up research. I'm not sure about these incentives. If I understood you correctly, I might be wrong. That's probably not a solution here. And I guess if you would want to look at education and economic activities, sometimes that works best if it's guided from the bottom up, than money brought in other ways, as a lot of development projects in fact show. But the question is where to begin, because there are so many of these localities. We only visited 5 or 6, and I guess there are so many more where this is an issue. So clearly, continuing with it is I think an important step forward. Matt, maybe you want to add to.
Thanks. I think this was an interesting example of how policy and governance is increasingly multi-level and multi-stakeholder and multi-regulations. So we already discussed this a couple of times in this seminar. You know, there is the central government in Jakarta, there are regional governments, there are district governments, there are local governments, and then we're only talking about governments. So, and next we start talking about companies, non-governmental organizations, local fishermen, etc., etc. And it seems like I'm making the problem more complex. But I think if we kind of miss out, if we start to focus on one stakeholder or two stakeholders, and we don't include the other ones, we don't include companies or non-governmental organizations or academics for that sake, the role of universities and basic, I think we're missing out. So I think when we get a new project and we go back, we rather increase the number of participants and stakeholders than decrease it. So I think that is always an important message also to researchers. If you have to be exclusive and you have to exclude certain stakeholders, be aware that you are excluding certain stakeholders. Don't be surprised in the end that your project, you know, doesn't answer certain questions. So inclusivity is necessary, but not always possible. But if you have to be exclusive, know that you are exclusive and why you have to be exclusive. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Professor Norman. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to end the session now because we ran out of time. But I will first highlight some points from today's presentation. So Professor Koning has highlighted that implications of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is huge for sustainable development. It is high time for both national and international policymakers involve local fishing communities in dealing with illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing due to the fact they are knowledgeable agents who can help as eyes and ears, as is mentioned in the slide, spying illegal activities and identifying misconduct happening at the sea if they are empowered. Furthermore, Professor Koning and also Professor Matt Norman has highlighted about the importance of collaboration among different agents. Hopefully we can follow it up. So, well, that's the highlighted points of today's webinar. On behalf of UKSW, I would like again thank Professor Julie Koning and Professor Matt Norman for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you also for all the audience. I hope to see you again in our next webinars. Have a good evening and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for having us. And sampai jumpa, everybody.
Sampai jumpa.
Just to let you know, Titi, if somebody wants the paper, yes. I'm happy to send the paper to people interested in the paper. So
yeah, sure.
You can share my email or just let me know.
Yeah, I will share it to everybody.
Yeah,
the participants. Yeah.
For those interested. Okay. Hey, lovely to see you. Stay well.
Yes. Thank you. Safe. You too. You too.
Hopefully we can meet sometime soon in the future. Face to face.
I hope so. Yes.
Thanks for organizing.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.